So, Bishop Barron, welcome to Clerically Speaking.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, you guys.
We're very clerical today.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm actually a little disappointed because in our Zoom meeting, we were in the two boxes up top and Bishop Barron's on the bottom for us, which is reverse hierarchy, which makes me uncomfortable, but it's nothing personal.
I'm on the top on my screen
Good,
here.
that makes sense. That works. So I want to start off with a very important question, Bishop, because a lot of people want to know. And I hope you feel comfortable answering this. We want to know who can bench more, you or Father Steve Grunow?
There's no question about that. I stopped bench pressing when I was probably in high school, so I think he can easily out bench press me.
Okay, that's fair.
That's fair. So we're really happy to have you on. One of the key parts of our podcast is we really like to reflect on the nature of the priesthood. We like to share people the inner, in a general way, the inner workings of the priestly life, and to give people a little peek behind the curtain of what priests go through every day.
Yeah.
And that's been a really, I think, helpful thing for a lot of Catholics who listen to our podcast. Now, you yourself, before you became auxiliary in LA, you were formed you were the rector at Mundelein Seminary. For how long?
Rector for only 3 years, 2012 through 2015.
And how long were you in formation there for?
Long time. So I was on the faculty from 92 until kind of on and off until I became rector. But for maybe the 7 years before becoming rector, I was doing a lot of this work in evangelization and media, but I was still teaching part-time. So for many years, I was involved as a teacher at Mundelein.
Okay, awesome. So now, I think one thing people maybe, seminary is this kind of vague thing for a lot of people. They're not sure why does the church have her seminary system? Why is that important in the formation of future priests?
Well, the word comes from seminarium, which means seedbed. So a place where seeds can grow into these plants that we hope are lively and flourishing. So it's a place of cultivation, and we say now discernment. It's a place where you can ask and answer those questions well. So is God calling me? Part of that is a theological education. Part of it is spiritual direction. Part of it is formation. Part of it is human formation. But the overall purpose of a seminary is to be the locus, the place where you can ask and answer those questions effectively. Because finally, it's not a matter of what you want, it's what God wants. And so you're discerning now, is this what I want to do with my life? That's the wrong question. Is this what God wants me to do with my life? And there are different ways to ask and answer that question. So that's what a seminary really is all about.
So you were in seminary formation. Did you enter out of high school for seminary for yourself?
No, I went to the University of Notre Dame my first year out of high school. And then my second year in college, I transferred to the college seminary outside Chicago. And then from there, I got this Basilian Scholarship, which is a scholarship at Catholic University in Washington. So I began at Notre Dame, then entered the college seminary, and then went to Catholic U. And I got my master's degree in philosophy from Catholic U. And then I came back to Mundelein to do my own formation as a priest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so different priestly assignments, are different, obviously. Did you ever have an interest in seminary formation? Was it a surprise when you were asked to do it? How did that work out?
Well, I was in a parish for 3 years. Of course, in those days, too, we did a whole year as deacon in a parish. So I was in a very busy parish on the southwest side of the city of Chicago. And then I was sent to a parish near O'Hare Airport. If you've flown into O'Hare, you've been right near the parish where I was. They knew that when I was a student at the seminary that I was, good at theology and philosophy and that sort of thing. And I had an academic interest. So they were always looking for potential professors. So I think, they knew, and I kind of knew that possibly I would be asked to go for studies. And so after 3 years in a parish, I was invited to go for doctoral studies and went over to Paris and did that.
But I think a lot of people understand what makes a good pastor. People have had experience of a priest as a pastor. But the skills of being a pastor aren't necessarily the same as being a good formator. What makes a priest a good formator in seminary?
Well, I guess I'd look at those 4 pillars of formation from Pastoris Dabo Vobis, the famous text of John Paul II, human formation. So are you good at helping people develop psychologically and personally and physically, to be a strong, integral person. There's spiritual formation. Are you a person of prayer? Do you know how to guide other people into prayer? My specialty would have been intellectual formation. So are you trained as a theologian? Can you help people think their way through the faith? And then pastoral formation. Can you help people learn to be a good pastor? And so everyone at Mundelein, with a couple of exceptions, maybe some of the real old timers on the faculty, but the rest of us all had substantial pastoral experience. Mine was, if you count the deacon year, 4 years in 2 very busy parishes. So there's really nothing a parish priest does that I didn't do at some point. So I think those 4 areas, if you're competent. Now I specialized in one. So different faculty members will specialize in different areas. Mine was in theology, but I think all 4 are important if you're going to do seminary work.
So it was interesting when we were in seminary, we always joked about how often we heard about Pastoris Stabos Vobis. It was like, because you just hear it over and over. Okay. Yes. We get it, the 4 pillars. But it kind of, in a way, that repetition kind of got it ingrained in you. Yeah. I think in some ways, one of the most revolutionary things, in a good sense of the word revolution, that John Paul II did was introduce human formation to the seminary program. Can you talk a bit about the impact of introducing that as a pillar into priestly formation?
Well, I think he's a good Thomist there, right? Thomas would say grace builds on nature. And so if your natural formation, if you want, your human formation isn't solid, then we're trying to build this kind of edifice of grace on top of that. It's not going to last. So I think it is foundational. Now, it's not the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Probably my generation, just after the council, would have gotten maybe a hyper stress on, call it psychological formation, maybe to the detriment of theological and spiritual formation. So I don't think he means that in some exclusive way, but I think it's a foundational element. And when I was, especially as rector, when it was really my responsibility to make the final call about a student, I was always very attentive to human formation. Is this a normal, healthy human being relating well to people with a sense of humor, a sense of his own limitations? I mean, all the things you look for in healthy psychological development, I looked very carefully for that when I was rector. But then that's not the whole story. I mean, you can be a very psychologically well-adjusted person, but not a very good priest. So, there's more to it than just being a good, well-adjusted person. Then you have to have these other elements of formation too.
As a seminarian, maybe it's because we're constantly being evaluated, but one of our hobbies was to critique the seminary system. And the one thing we would often go back and forth on is, and every seminary is obviously different. I went to Catholic University and theological college.
Oh, you were a TC guy.
I was TC
okay, well,
guy.
I lived there for 3 years, yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things we would talk about is the seminary model formatted or wedded too much to the academic model? Like it felt like most of our time and energy was put into academic studies, and we had other formation, but that happened more in spiritual direction and formation advising, when you were one-on-one with a priest talking about your discernment, your spiritual life, what was going on. And part of me, like, is there value in integrating more of a mentorship sort of thing? Because I felt like that's where I got most of my formation. The academic work is great, but I don't know if you had thoughts on that.
Well, of course, everyone's got a spiritual director in the seminary. So, and then you've got a what we call the formation advisor at Mundelein. So you had 2 figures who were there kind of as in a mentoring role. The formation advisor had to report to the rector and to the bishop and so on when he visited. Then, of course, the spiritual director, we use our jargon, was the internal forum person, right? It was all private between you and the spiritual director. So I like that relationship, as you call it, mentoring one. And then, of course, in pastoral formation, guys would go out to a parish. I'm not sure how TC does that now, but we had, pretty strong pastoral programs at Mundelein where you had a mentor there who was guiding you through that process. I would say, actually, in my time, now I'm going back before you guys, we probably underplayed the academic. And I think in the wake of John Paul II and all that, we brought that back into a stronger position. But you could always debate, I suppose, which one is getting too much emphasis. It's a matter of prudence. I thought at Mundelein we hit the balance pretty well. But I do like the mentoring idea. So spiritual director, formation advisor, someone that really is going to walk with you. And that was the way I always put it when I was rector was, is this guy exhibiting all 4 dimensions of formation? And, be attentive to all of them.
And I think it's Denver. They have almost like a parish model, like where a lot of guys live in a house or in a rectory with their formation head, and their ministries in that parish, so they get integrated into parish life a bit more, which I've always found a very fascinating model.
You know what that goes back to? I remember it very well when I was a student in Paris.
Yeah.
Cardinal Lustiger, who was in some ways the John Paul II of France. He was this wonderful, charismatic figure. I used to hear him preach all the time on Sunday evening at Notre Dame. But anyway, Lustiger had that model, which was what you're describing.
Yeah.
And I remember Cardinal George of Chicago, this goes back many years, was intrigued by it, to have like groups of seminarians live in a parish and then commute to some place where they would have their studies. But the main focus would be their community life within a parish context. So, I think there's something interesting about that.
And there's something I think because one of the problems today is like a lot of people think priests are lonely, priests are unhappy, etc. And there's odd views around celibacy sometimes that people see celibacy as a burden and not as a gift. And I think something like this model can actually help build up the idea, like that priests, even if they're not living together, they've built up a friendship and a brotherhood together in community, so that community flows out after their formation.
Yeah.
I mean, I know for myself, ours was a regional seminary, and so our guys were from Vancouver Island to Winnipeg, and who came out for formation. We almost never see each other, but we try our best to keep in touch. And if sometimes we'll go on vacations together and stuff like this to keep that, because that's the whole point of seminary. And I just find like if you're in a more local place like Chicago or something like that, or Denver, that model can really help build up the presbyterate in the future.
I've always felt strongly about that. And we've talked about it for a long time. We've never really done it though, which is to get priests living together in an intentional community. As you say, it can work better in a Chicago or an urban area where priests can then go out to their various places. In your part of the world, it might be tougher to do that. But I've always liked that idea. Call it a semi-monastic, if you want, or a community life is built up around prayer in common, meals in common, because I hate that loneliness of the priest. It can happen if a guy gets isolated and they start living as a loner. There can be very bad things associated with that. So I like priests, having a chance to live in community.
Well, plus when you're in community, you rub up against each other sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Those normal human interactions that actually form you as a human being will make you a better priest.
Yeah. Yeah. But, I'm glad you mentioned something, though, which is this impression out there that priests are unhappy. Remember, this goes back, I don't know, maybe it's 10 years or longer, those surveys that were done. One was on the cover of Time magazine, I remember. And it was this, to a lot of people, very surprising finding that of all the professions, the happiest people were clergy people. So not just Catholic priests, but Catholic priests were especially high in that regard. You look at the whole range of occupations and vocations, clergy people were the happiest. But there is this common view, and of course the sex abuse scandal didn't help one little bit with that perception. But it's a false perception that priests are kind of a brooding, unhappy bunch. It's really on the contrary. Yeah. The objective evidence was showing over and over again. Also, what's his name? Stephen Rossetti, Monsignor Rossetti, who's done a lot of work with troubled priests and so on, has always maintained that the statistics indicate that clergy people are among the happiest people in our society.
Yeah, but I want to bring some of the practicalities of living in community in a diocese right now, because the experience of a lot of guys who've been ordained around my time, give or take 10 years, have started to float this idea and floated at a priest council and this sort of thing. But there's some practical difficulties that we run into. Like one of my concerns is I would never want living community to get in the way of obedience to the bishop as far as assignments and how you do that. Mm-hmm. And another thing that we kind of ran up against was there's some worry about some members of the presbyterate that there would be kind of a cliquishness. Like if you get all these young guys who think the same way, could that be a problem? Which I agree with. I think sometimes when we think of community, or people talk about community, they think about getting all of your best friends to live together. And anyone who's spent any time in seminary and religious know this as well. That's not really what community is, you know?
Yeah, and that's fair, I think. At Mundelein, we call them cams from a camerata in Latin, but they were little sections of the house where the students lived, hallways. And the idea behind the cam was that you'd have a mix of years and a mix of, perspectives, and you didn't want what you're describing, like we're all, the people that think the same way. And the idea was to prepare people to live in rectories where you'd have a mix. Now, to be fair, that's changed a lot. When the cams were invented back in the 1920s, you had rectories with lots of priests in them, 4 or 5 sometimes. Now it's more typical, even in a place like Chicago, that a priest is by himself or maybe one other person. So it is different. But I think you're right, and you have to be careful with that. And you're right, the bishop has the prerogative to assign, and it can't be a matter of, well, look, I won't go there because then I can't be living with the community I'm used to. So I get that. But I think we probably could, with a little, brain power, work that one out.
Yeah, I have a friend who's in a religious community in Canada, and he told me, like, the older generation, they don't think the same way theologically as he does, but because of their community life and the charity that's shown towards each other, like, he's come to actually really appreciate them. He says to me, he has this beautiful thing. He says, Harrison, they could have left in the 70s, but they stayed.
Yeah, right.
And he goes, and he really helped me to change my mindset about that. He says, no, these are people who are, maybe I don't agree with everything sometimes, but these people stayed. They want to be faithful to the church. And that life of community where there were those differences really helped them appreciate the difference and to live common charity together. But,
yeah, quite right.
But, this also brings up something else then is as I'm sure you're aware, we're on the verge of like a bit of a demographic cliff around the priesthood. And I, as a younger priest, I look at things and I think in 10 years in my diocese, there might be 5 incarnated guys at work because the rest have either retired or have passed on. Do you have advice? Because I think this is a common experience right now. It's like we're recognizing that there was a generation gap, it seems, almost in vocations. And so there's going to be a gap that's going to come along, and there's going to be a lot more responsibility placed on younger guys, perhaps quicker than they would like, and which would probably be normal. Do you have advice for younger priests out there about that? And like, how can the church respond to this in a robust way?
Yeah, it's a good question. Priests have got to reproduce themselves, right? I think it's very important that priests find their own successors. And there might have been a time when we weren't as attentive to that as we should have been. Priests say, well, okay, here's my life, but I'm not going to try to draw someone to it. But we should, that's part of our responsibility. And maybe get 2 people to replace you, get 2 or 3. So I think that's incumbent upon all priests, old and young, is to keep your eyes open for someone that can succeed you. For the younger guys in themselves, I'd say stay close to your life of prayer and stay focused on the work that's in front of you. In a way, you can't solve, a grand demographic problem, but stay faithful and stay connected to the spiritual sources. But keep your eyes open all the time for your successors. I think that's extremely important. We've been wrestling with this for a long time. When I was your age, when I was younger, everyone saw the same thing. Now, it didn't collapse. And one interesting thing is even the sex abuse scandal didn't cause it to collapse. We in the seminary world, kept waiting for the numbers to fall off the table. And frankly, they didn't, even in the wake of the scandals. We kept waiting for it, and it never happened. So, don't give up hope, but keep looking for your successors, I'd say.
Yeah, going back to kind of what we talked about just a moment ago, as far as generational gaps in presbyterates, the one thing I found interesting, it's kind of difficult to get guys together to have a conversation. Because, my diocese right now still has a good number of priests, some of which I've never had a conversation with. And it seems the difficulty is whenever the diocese tries to do a meeting of priests, either annual or whatever, there's I think everyone likes complaining about their boss, right? Because it's just a human thing to do.
Right.
And there's sometimes like just distrust, or like you can take all your crankiness out on someone else. It's an easy thing to do.
Right.
So that sometimes those aren't as fruitful as they would like them to be. So my question is, in your experience as a bishop, is there a better way to go about this? Is there, do you have any ideas about how to facilitate that communication between priests, talking about the more difficult things?
No, I get you, because back in the day, I did a lot of talks to presbyterate. So bishops would call upon me to come and, presbyteral day and the big retreat. And you get, in some cases, hundreds of guys in the room, the older guys in the golf shirts, the younger guys in Roman collars. And, so I'm used to that. And I would always try to find something that I thought would draw us all together as followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, and not so much get into the nitty gritty of some divisive issue. But I get your point that in those big gatherings, it can be really hard, because it's either people get up and they give a speech, or it's just too big to facilitate a conversation. What I think is better, get a small group. So I don't know, maybe priests around you, get 2 or 3 younger, 2 or 3 older guys. Let's have dinner. And maybe something like this: have the older guys identify a book that meant a lot to them in their priesthood. The younger guys do the same thing. And then let's read the 2 books together. And then maybe have several sessions where we talk about that. Like, why did that book mean so much to you? Maybe to ask an older guy, when you were 30, you read this book and it really made a difference to you. And then you say, well, here's the books that we're reading and why they mean so much to us. That might be a better way to do it, when it's a little more local, fewer people, and you're focused on something objective, something external to all of you. That might work.
Speaking of books, you have a new book, Renewing
I
Our
do,
Hope.
yeah.
Yes. And maybe do you just want to talk about it quickly, about why you wrote this, why you put this out?
Yeah, it's published by Catholic U Press, which I was very happy about, my old alma mater. And it's a collection of essays and talks and speeches I've given the last roughly 5 years. So most of them since I've been a bishop, couple from before I was named a bishop. They're roughly gathered around this theme, I'd say, of evangelization, which has been my main preoccupation. But call it the evangelization of the culture, which is, Cardinal George's great theme, and he sort of bequeathed that to me. He got it from John Paul II. And most of the essays are around that. So, the question of the nuns, right, the unaffiliated, and how do we reach them, and so on. But also things like, relativism within the culture. There's also a sermon I gave at the first ordination of priests that I did. I ordained a group of Dominicans last year, and I have the homily I gave to them, and kind of laying out what I think is the task of a priest today. So it's a whole slew of essays. Some are very academic. So I kind of miss that. My training and my whole background was as a professor. And that's, if you'd asked me, 20 some years ago, I would have envisioned that was my trajectory, was to go into university work and all that. So I miss it. And I try every year to accept at least a couple invitations to do a serious paper. So it keeps my mind in the game, and doing research work. So a lot of what you read there are those lectures and talks.
So in this book, you have an article about an evangelizing priest.
Yeah.
That you say that they have to be deeply in love with Jesus. They have to know the story of Israel. They have to be deeply and critically conversant with contemporary culture, and formed to see transcendence and to point people towards it, and to have the heart of missionaries. So I think I would agree. I mean, I totally agree with that, obviously. And yet, but where are these new fields of missions? Because I think this is the thing, in a way, how do I want to put it? We love to talk about evangelization a lot in the church, but we struggle to go the next step. So how can priests, and I think we can also extend this, because I think all those qualities extend to lay people as well, right?
Sure. Yeah.
How can we, what are these new mission fields, and how can the church navigate them? Because I think sometimes there's a fear. This is all new, right? And so when something's new, we tend to be a little bit hesitant, tend to be maybe afraid of making mistakes, etc.
Yeah.
But I think we need to have that courage to make that next step. So how do we make these next steps of evangelizing and keeping those core missionary ideas in our mind.
Well, in terms of,
I'm going to pause you there. Just
we got
the
garbage truck is pulling.
We'll just cut off your guys' audio right at that point.
And then I'll, okay.
Everybody can get a sip of water. I'm going to let that pass so we get clean audio on his end, and you should be able to pair them. It's just getting really ridiculous. I'm going to ask, check real quick and ask if anyone's out here to be quiet as well. So here's some voices. Just 1 second. Thanks, guys.
No problem.
It's not really too soundproof, this little studio. So. And the garbage truck backs up at a certain point. And,
we sometimes when we record at my old parish, we would be at the time when the garbage truck was coming. And
Oh yeah. Where'd you go to seminary? Vancouver. Where'd you go to?
So I went to St. Joseph Seminary at Edmonton.
Oh, in Edmonton.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Vancouver sends their guys to the Abbey and Mission. So Vancouver Island though sends their guys. Most people send their guys to Edmonton. So I did my MDiv there, and I also did my MTH there as well.
Not Mount Angel. No one goes down there to Mount Angel in Oregon.
There's been the odd guy from Calgary who goes down there, but
they are odd guys. Those Calgarians.
Yeah, they are. But but otherwise, it's just been.
Oh, by the way, say the name of that city again that starts with a C.
Calgary.
That. Yeah. See, we have this guy, Matt Nelson, works for us, and he's from that part of the world.
Yeah.
He says Calgary.
Okay, Calgary.
Calgary, and I said to him, I've never ever heard anyone say Calgary. And he goes, oh, yeah, that's how we say it. But I've never ever heard a Canadian besides Matt say Calgary.
Yeah. I met Matt.
Do it yourself if you want.
I met Matt at your priest conference a couple years ago.
Oh, you were there for that,
yes,
preaching
I was there
conference?
for that. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah. So, but I've never heard another Canadian say Calgary.
Calgary.
Yeah, you can tell Matt he's wrong.
I've never heard a Canadian confirm his point of view on that. Okay, so I'm going to respond. Are we done there, Joe? With the okay. It was the mission field thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You ready?
Yeah. We got a little bit of it on the book thing, but I think it's fine.
Oh, it's all right. Okay, set.
Settling. Yeah, Bishop, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, in terms of the mission field, I just think the nuns, the NONES, this army now of especially young people who claim no religious affiliation, I think that's a great way for the church to focus its energies on that group of people. And they're especially strong in the under 30 set. So I'd say to any evangelizing priest, focus your attention there. And then secondly, I'd say the best way to reach them is social media, because they're not going to come to our churches. To be frank, when I was at the Youth Synod in Rome back in 2018, so I was a delegate to that synod, and we're talking about this all the time, young people, how to reach them. And I felt so much of the conversation was still, to me, it was very old-fashioned. It was parish programs and how to get them to our parishes and at one point I did stand up at the synod and say, but they're not going to come to our parish programs. I said, that's an old school approach. And we have to use this great tool we've been given of the social media to reach out. So, Word on Fire in many ways, my ministry has all been born of this, a desire to evangelize precisely this group and precisely using the tools given to us. I think that's the most exciting mission field and the most exciting means that we got going right now.
Do you find there's hesitancy around the use of social media in church leadership?
Well, church leadership, not so much, they don't get it. Now that's increasingly not the case. I think as church leadership moves along, the standard older generation, I think, had a hard time understanding it. But young priests like yourselves, certainly get it. They certainly understand it. They know the social media by direct experience. I had to learn it very kind of, through indirect experience. Mm-hmm. But no, I think that's shifting. I think they are beginning to get it. I hear it a lot at the bishops' conference. We start talking about something, inevitably someone will say, but we have to do this in digital form, or we have to do this through video or through media. We can't just be writing a document. So I think they are beginning to understand that. That's something I did as chair of the committee. I'm ending my time as chair of the Evangelization Committee, but whenever I could, I would make the case about the nuns and about the best way to reach them.
I agree with all that, but also at some point in time, we do want them to come to the parish.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. But sometimes but what are we welcoming them into? And I think maybe a lot of us have heard horror stories of we talk to someone, we make a connection over social media, they go to their parish and they're underwhelmed. And I don't want to, because I think there can be an emphasis where if you have a perfect liturgy, then everything will be fixed forever.
Right.
And while I think there's an importance in liturgy being done well, so I guess some things I struggle with is, and maybe you can speak to younger priests in this. What is the role of a parochial vicar in a parish? How do you handle things if there's different philosophies in your parish? Because sometimes I think there's some frustration, or sometimes I worry about young guys kind of being burnt out by just ordinary parish life and the inability to kind of be more of a part of the vision, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a lot of issues there, I think.
Know, yeah.
It's okay. In terms of like the burnout thing, there you've to stay close to the spiritual sources, and that's, your prayer and study and all that. I mean, so that's really key. Find something in your ministry, though, that you really are passionate about. Now, like any job or profession or vocation, there are things you have to do that maybe aren't in your wheelhouse. It's not like you're the... Sure, yeah. And, when I was a professor, I always hated grading papers. I just did. I hated it. But I did it. And I used to say to myself, well, okay, this is work. I love teaching. I love, interacting with the students. I love reading to get ready for a course. I hated reading and grading papers. Okay. Same is true in parish life. There are certain things you have to do, or things that maybe you're not all that great at, but you still have to do them. Okay. That's par for the course. But in the midst of that, find something you are really excited about. This goes back now, centuries. When I was newly ordained, and I'm in this parish, I'm 26 years old, doing all the usual parish things, but I decided to do, an adult formation thing. And so it was like every other Tuesday, or maybe it was every Tuesday in the evening. And I just invited people to come, and we do Bible study and theology, and I would give talks. And well, I loved it. I loved it. It was sort of my wheelhouse. It was what I was good at. And this lovely community was built up over time. And, okay, that was where I got a lot of my excitement from. But then, you have to do the other things too that might not be in your wheelhouse. But for you guys, I think doing what you're doing with the podcast. And I've told parish priests, start a website, start a YouTube video, start talking about what's going on in the culture, a Q&A thing. I don't know if you knew about this. I've done it twice now, this Reddit AMA. Do you know about that? The Ask Me Anything. And both times was really interesting to me. And both times they were hugely popular. And as I always say, not because of me. I'm sure 99% had no idea who I was. But I was announcing myself simply as a bishop who likes to talk to atheists and non-believers. And we got these enormous responses, Well, I was able to discern very quickly what's on the mind of young people. And, okay, here's a bishop at least responding. So I've told young guys, I can click them off for if you want, the things that are most central. There's your program now for youth outreach, or there's your lecture series, or there's a series of videos you could do is addressing these issues. So I think there's a lot of creative things you can do, and find something you're really passionate about.
Great. So the other thing we wanted to talk to you about today, is awesome stuff on priesthood, and I hope people find a lot of fruit in it. But you've been talking a lot lately about the Second Vatican Council. And we are big fans of the council here at Clerically Speaking. We've talked about it a lot. Because I remember for me, I actually took an elective course on the council at my seminary, and my teacher, Father Don McDonald, who was a great mentor to me, he's a Franciscan, great mentor. His class on Vatican II just really helped me shape for me how central the council is. That actually it's a way it's building up the church again to deal with these new cultural forces that we've never seen before, and trying to get deeper into the church's identity as the sacrament of salvation, etc. So I know for me personally, Vatican II is huge, so. But as you know, too, there's resistance to the council that's emerged, and it's getting a bit stronger. And I think Father Anthony can attest to this too. Initially, it seemed like just like an online conversation, But now it's seeping into the parishes. I'm seeing it pastorally. Where do you think this resistance come from, and why do you think the church is like? Why do you think the council really is actually the response we need?
Well, a first observation is this. As a Catholic, you can't be opposed to an ecumenical council gathered, as they say, cum petro et sub petro, right, with Peter and under Peter's authority. There's no higher authority in the life of the church than an ecumenical council gathered by the Pope and under his leadership and with his approval. And so it's just bad ecclesiology. It's just bad Catholicism to say, oh yeah, Vatican II, we should dispense with that. What you have heard from people today, with that view, I have zero patience. And I think no priest should have any patience with the view that we can somehow dispense with or, pick and choose what we like from a council. As I argued, why not do it with Chalcedon and Trent and Vatican I? So I have zero patience with that. Now, where's it coming from, some of this frustration? I get it. The church has got all kinds of issues and problems. We just lived through the sex abuse scandal. We've gone through, in the West, I want to point out, in Europe and Canada, America, and so on, we have gone through a decline in different areas of the church's life. And so people get frustrated, they get angry, and it's a convenient target to say, there it is, this big council, prior to the council, everything was great, then there's this great decline, the council is the problem. Well, let's get two problems, both in formal logic. One is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, right? Because it came after, it must be because of. And so there's that tendency to say, oh, well, these things happened after the council, therefore the council's to blame. The other logical problem is the fallacy of singular causality. So we can find one great cause for all the troubles we're having. The decline in certain areas of church life in the West is a very complex phenomenon and is caused by all sorts of factors. A couple observations. One is, look at the church in Africa. The post-conciliar African Catholic Church is flourishing, is booming. And trust me, it's not based on a nostalgic return to the Latin Mass. I mean, I've been to Africa and seen African liturgies. To me, it's a beautiful example of the rich enculturation of the faith that Vatican II was about. Look at the church in parts of Asia where it's flourishing. There is a kind of myopia of a lot of people in the West to say, well, looking at our culture and our society, things look grim in certain ways. So I think you've got to get past that and accept a much richer account of how we, in our part of the world, got into our situation. So those are a couple of general thoughts about it. The bottom line is we can't be distancing ourselves from or calling radically into question an ecumenical council. Better to find the authentic purpose and meaning of the council. My great mentor, Cardinal George, always maintained Vatican II was a missionary council. Its purpose was to bring the lumen to the gentes, the lumen being Christ, bring him out to the peoples of the world. So bring Christ to the modern world. It wasn't a radical rethinking of our doctrines. It wasn't. There was no need for that. Vatican II is not a rupture with the great doctrinal tradition of the church. It was more of a missionary council, and therefore, yes, indeed, had a pastoral focus, I would say, to bring Christ to the nations. When we read the texts under that rubric and we read them carefully on their own terms, I think we find a very rich articulation of what the mission still is, So anyway, I'm very impatient with this dismissal of Vatican II, which I think is inadmissible for a Catholic and represents a very immature appreciation of the council texts themselves. So end of harangue on that.
No, that was good. But I think with the an increase in common rejection or difficulties with the council and the difficulty with authority right now, both as a culture and in the church because of the scandal, I think are very interrelated.
Yeah.
And so I think, just as a culture, one of the things that we struggle with most is this Catholic idea of obedience. And it's one of those things that I find difficult to preach about. Just like no one likes to preach about asking for money, even though it's an important thing and even a spiritual thing for a parish. Like it's very difficult to talk about obedience because immediately people think like, well, should you be obedient to McCarrick? Should you be obedient to this? Could you say a few words maybe about like the Catholic understanding of obedience, of proper authority in the church?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have a hierarchical church. And so, as we priests know that when you're ordained, you put your hands within the hands of the man ordaining you. And do you promise obedience and respect to me and my successors? And I did that with Joseph Bernardin in 1986. I had no idea who Francis George even was at that point, but he became one of his successors. And I was obedient to him. And so, I mean, that structure is fundamental to Catholicism. Now, are there limits to it? Sure. You don't obey someone who's commanding you to do something that's intrinsically evil. So you've got an authority figure and you're beholden to him, but he's telling you to do something that you know to be morally objectionable. Of course, there's a limit to that obedience. Would a priest, let's say in Washington, when Cardinal McCarrick was Archbishop, and he's giving him, his assignment, is he obliged to obey him? Yeah, sure. If he's telling him to do something immoral, of course not. So it's not a sort of blind or unquestioning, uncritical obedience. It's not I'm just following orders kind of obedience. No. There's a moral limit, spiritual limit. If your superior is telling you to renounce your Christian faith, well, of course you don't obey that. So no, there are clear limits to it. And I get people's frustration. I mean, trust me, I wrote a little book about it called Letter to a Suffering Church about, the frustration of the Catholic people that I feel as a Catholic. I mean, before I'm a priest or bishop, I'm a Catholic, and my own frustration with what I called a rot in the priesthood. Not that all priests are rotten, but that there was something the matter. There was something the matter in the priesthood, and there was something the matter with the leadership of the church that allowed this thing to flourish as long as it did. So I have no hesitation naming all of that and raising my voice that it would change, and that laity and priests and bishops should do all they can to make that change. So I have no quarrel with that, but none of that speaks against obedience in the legitimate spiritual sense, that I'm under obedience to a legitimate authority who's commanding me in a way that is not repugnant to morality or the spiritual life. I guess that's how I'd put it,
Yeah. And there seems to be kind of a growing need for this is me silly, like a new evangelization. Like I think many young people who have really have discovered kind of the riches of the Catholic tradition on their own. And there's sometimes can be a feeling of betrayal, like why didn't I learn this at my parish? And then there's an anger with what's going on as far as the scandal, and they find people who share that same anger, and that's a relief. And so there's a trust built with this person, and then they get led down doctrinal errors and this sort of thing, right? And so if there's not already a respect for someone who's trying to bring them out of it, like it feels like you need. Okay, my question is, how much do you go into the weeds about this and that doctrinal thing? But part of me feels like this is actually more of a spiritual problem, more so than intellectual.
No, let me just stay with that for a second. I think it's like someone is so angry that they burn down their own house with themselves in it. You know what I'm saying? So am I angry at McCarrick? Am I angry at the rot in the priesthood? Am I angry at the terrible abuse of authority that took place in way too many cases? Yes. And am I going to wield a torch to try to burn that stuff down or burn it out? Yes. Or like a good surgeon to go in and cut that out. What you don't want to become is a firebrand who takes that and I'm going to burn the whole house down and I'll go down with it. Or be such a ham-handed surgeon as I'm cutting out the cancer, I'm also destroying every organ in the body. That's the trouble, frankly, with some of the rad-trad crowd. I think that, yes, they're angry. I get it. I'm angry too about these things. But you don't burn the house down. You direct your anger appropriately and prudently so that you can excise what's problematic. But that's why, like, an attack on the Second Vatican Council, That's burning the house down. Because you burn down Second Vatican Council, what's going to stop you from burning down the Council of Trent or the Council of Nicaea or Chalcedon? What's going to stop you? As I've said before, you've adopted a fundamentally Protestant ecclesiology. And now I know you think you're Mr. Uber conservative Catholic, but you become a Protestant effectively. If you're saying my private judgment has authority over a council, I can decide based on my own private whim what's acceptable or not in a council, that's called burning the whole house down. So don't burn the house down, just burn the things that need cleansing. You know what I'm saying? So that's my second harangue. But that's what I see. Yeah. And what you're drawing attention to, I think, in a good way, that's the problem. Or the old image, you're sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. So I'm so angry at some of these dead branches, but I'm going to cut the whole tree down that I'm sitting in. So anyway, that's the problem, it seems to me.
So you kind of continuing with this line of thought, and it's something you mentioned a bit earlier, the fact that the council is a missionary council, right? And this is this is just observable from magisterial documents that come out. Like I really noticed a real turn in the magisterium. Before the council, you hear about kind of mission as like maybe to the third world or to Africa or whatever. That's a missionary, right? But after the council, like every single pope is just banging on the door, mission, mission, mission. And I think this is the hidden gem of the effect of the council. I think we're starting to unravel it a little bit in a good way, but it also means that we were lacking something prior to the council, right? That the church was lacking something. And I, in my own little research around the council and around the theology of Pope Benedict, I've done a lot of reading about what was the church like in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And it wasn't as ideal as people think it was. Like I remember reading this article by Ratzinger where he is, it's in the 1950s, and he's decrying against the horrible catechesis in Germany, right? So the council comes along to try and say we need to reinvigorate our catechetical methods. We need to reinvigorate ourselves as a missionary church to correct this. So like, I guess my question is going around along these lines. Why was the council really called, and what needed to be fixed?
Well, take this as a starting point. So you've got, 2,500 or so bishops gathered from all over the world at Vatican II, the largest conciliar gathering in history. And the votes, I think the closest vote was Dignitatis Humanae was like 2,300 and something to 70. That was the closest vote there was. The other documents are all like 2,450 to 5, right? Yeah. Look at the lineup. My point there is, in 1962 to 1965, 2,500 bishops from all over the world overwhelmingly voted for the Vatican II documents. That tells me something. That tells me that they felt something was needed. There was a development needed, I say doctrinally and pastorally. It's naive in the extreme to say, gosh, everything was great. Just go back to 1957, everything was just great. Well, then riddle me this. Why did all these men overwhelmingly vote for the Vatican II documents? I could see if the votes were really real close. There was a lot of debate. There was debate, to be sure, but once they worked through the text, they overwhelmingly voted for them. That tells you a lot about what they perceive the need to be. Now, what was it? Read the documents. Go through them one by one, and you'll see exactly what they felt needed. In our understanding of the church, to get away from maybe a hyper hierarchical, totally priest-centered view of the church to this much more, holiness of all the laity and the missionary purpose of the church and all that. That's what they saw the need to be. Go through the documents on priesthood, the documents on the laity. You'll see what they thought needed addressing. Now, the implementation of it, how people read and implemented those documents, that's a whole other issue. And I started my career as a writer criticizing the implementation of Vatican II in our country. So I'm certainly sympathetic with that. But I'm not sympathetic with the view that everything was hunky-dory in 1957, and then anomalously, the overwhelming majority of bishops all over the world made this massive mistake called Vatican II. With that, I have no sympathy.
So our time is coming close to an end, and I want to kind of end by asking. It's as I said to you before we recorded, a lot of our listeners are young, and like Anthony's questions and my questions come from listening to our listeners, who, by the way, told us to say thank you for your ministry. A lot of people were reaching out saying, please let them know. People saying, I came back to the church because of Word on Fire and stuff like. So they wanted to let you know you're doing good work.
I appreciate
which
that.
Which is always important to hear in ministry. Yeah. Sometimes you wonder, right? But one of the things that we notice, it seems to be like a bit of a hesitation in regards to public discussion around the implementation of the council is the question of liturgy. And as you've mentioned it before, some of the weird experimentations that went on after the council. Father Anthony and I, thankfully, because of our generation, we kind of missed a lot of that. Yeah. But I think sometimes there are legitimate questions around the church's liturgy. Like I remember reading stuff by Bouyer on this and his frustrations even around it. And Pope Benedict talks about how reform was perhaps in a bureaucratic way instead of an organic way. Yeah. So this is the question that seems to be the center for a lot of people. How can we move forward in this discussion? And is there a possibility for asking these questions around, did the reform happen as the council intended it?
Well, I think a good way to do that is to reread the document. Let's get a group of priests, maybe older and younger, together. Let's read together Sacrosanctum Concilium. Read it. I bet even a lot of priests, if they ran their eyes past it, maybe it's a long time ago, sit down together, maybe get 6 or 7 of you, have a nice dinner, and you're going to read together Sacrosanctum Concilium. And what does that tell us about the nature of the liturgy, the reform of the liturgy, what were clearly excesses in the way that the document was implemented? What are paths forward? Ratzinger's book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, from not that many years ago, I think is an attempt to do that, is to revisit Sacrosanctum Concilium. I would recommend that. Going back to the texts. I think in a way the Vatican II texts have been the most ignored, maybe. And one reason for that, to be honest, and here I'd be a bit critical, not of the content, but of the form. The Vatican II documents are egregious in the history of the Church, in the measure that they're more like extended essays than pithy doctrinal statements. So you look at Vatican I, you look at Trent, certainly, and there's a tendency just to kind of get to it and name it and define it. Vatican II chose the more expansive essay as the vehicle for communication. Well, there's a shadow side of that. The good side is obvious, that it's probably easier to read, it's more lyrical, it's more inviting, less, officious. The shadow side is it's susceptible to greater interpretive range, right? If you have an extended essay and using more imagistic language and so on, it's open to a wider range of interpretation. So that's the shadow side, if you want, of the form that Vatican II chose. But I'd recommend going back to those texts and in a docile spirit, read them again. Because my point there in talking about the form was, I think they weren't read. People got this big text, the documents of Vatican II, and it's like, oh gosh, how am I going to get through this whole thing? Read them one at a time together. We have the 60th anniversary coming up, right? In 2022 will be the 60th anniversary of the opening of Vatican II. Not a bad time to revisit those texts.
Absolutely. It's this is a personal plug, I guess, but this is I'm writing a book for OSV on the documents of the council. Like for the average layperson, who I get, if you don't have a theological education, this is not this is a hard document to read. And so my hope, and the idea is it's going to be released on the 60th anniversary. So that in the hope of like helping the people in the pews to say, this is what the council actually said. And this is why these things are important, because I think that's, I think unfortunately it's sometimes we forget that symbol matters in liturgy. And this is something Father Anthony brought up the other day in an interview he did. Like, symbol matters. And I think sometimes that gets lost in discussions around liturgy, that we need to find like the symbolic language again, because that helps us understand the sacramental nature of the church.
Well, that was key. And I'm glad you're writing that book. That's an important book.
Yeah.
And the church needs it. And it's what worries me, I must say, at the present moment, what's worrying me the most right now is this hostility toward Vatican II. Now, to be fair, the extreme right is doing that. The extreme left, too, has always been, in its own way, uneasy with Vatican II. And so, I say a plague on both your houses and read Vatican II. And it's not going to give you the rad trad extremism. It's not going to give you the liberal, let's, just surrender to the world project. It's Vatican II in all of its integrity, its theological richness, its spiritual depth. The greatest spirits of the 20th century in Catholicism produced those texts. The Bouillets and the Ratzingers and the Ronners and the Wojtylas and so on. I mean, the cream of the crop intellectually produced those texts, and then under the aegis of the bishops. That's a high moment in our Catholic history. And, those who, for different reasons and with different ideological purposes, want to dispense with those texts, plague on both your houses. And let's go back and read those texts lovingly and carefully.
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming on, Bishop Barron. We really appreciate the discussion.
Yeah, my pleasure.
This was awesome. Thank you.
This was an awesome discussion. I think the discussion really helped bring to fruition a lot of the things we've talked about on our podcast for these last 2 years. So I know our listeners will really appreciate the discussion.
Thanks for agreeing with everything we've said on previous episodes.
Yes, exactly.
Giving us your
That's my purpose
here.
here.
We really appreciate that. Thank you.
That's my purpose here. No, thank you guys. I enjoyed the conversation very much.
Yeah.